Hello and welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. This is the one lecture that I'm going to give for this week, the fifth week of the term. Essentially at this point, we've moved through putting together a kind of provisional theory of the mind. That theory was again divided into two parts, System 1 and System 2. And we've talked a lot about System 1 and how System 1 is presumably realized by an underlying hierarchically arranged modular structure. We've looked at this as it relates to belief and emotion. And then in the past week, we've just discussed how this kind of model of the mind relates to the physical world, right? So how does the mental world relate to the physical world? We've considered some different theories of how physical entities might instantiate minds. And we have also looked at the ideas that instead of talking about minds, we should maybe emphasize cognitive processes and construe cognitive processes as existing between our biological brains and objects in the world, cognitive artifacts, and indeed other cognitive systems. So today we're going to continue with the kind of general overview of the mind before we start dipping into specific areas of investigation within cognitive science in the next couple of weeks. So today we're going to be talking about certain notions that we may end up eliminating or that we may end up taking a kind of different stance on about the self. So we're going to be talking about the self, and we're going to be talking about some kind of eliminative or reductive views about the self, some views that really de-emphasize the self in certain important ways. And so what I want to start by talking about is how this kind of discussion of the self relates to System 2. So we've talked a lot about System 1 so far, but we haven't said very much about System 2. Indeed, all we've really said concretely about System 2 came about in the first few days. So right, in the first few days, we talked about the central system, System 2, under the kind of discussion of Kahneman. And Kahneman told us about System 2 that System 2 is going to be associated with subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration, that it's going to include the conscious or reasoning self. He suggested that System 2 has beliefs, makes choices, and decides what to think about and what to do, and that it can construct thoughts in an orderly series. So System 2, thought of in this way, is really what I have sometimes described as the person level mind, the kind of the level of the mind that we experience as ourselves, right? And I've used that term before. What is the part of the mind that we experience as ourselves? That may be thought to be System 2. So today we're going to talk about System 2 from this point of view by thinking about it as the self. And we're going to discuss the readings for today discuss two key questions related to the self. So one set of readings that you looked at will discuss how we know our own mental states, how we know what our own mental states are, how we know about our own minds. And the readings that relate to this are the very short reading by Knausgaard, the longer reading by Ryle, and then another short reading by Carruthers. So I'm going to spend some time first talking about this question, how do we know about our own mental states, and the kind of surprising view that I think Ryle and Carruthers put forward for how we know about our own mental states or our own minds. And then the other view, the other question that we're going to discuss today is the question of what is a self. So here, the two readings or the two works that were important for this question are the Dennett piece, The Self as a Center of Narrative Gravity, and also the Invisibilia podcast that you listen to. And so both of these are really downplaying any kind of rich notion of the self and suggesting that really selfhood isn't as rich as we might have initially thought. And ultimately here, I want to get around to an idea that maybe our conception of a person level self is a construction in some way. Maybe it's something that's built by a system that is in some ways quite modular, that tells us a story about who we are, that allows us to coordinate our actions and exist in the world, but really is in some sense creating a story when it's doing this. So that's ultimately where we're going to end up today, is with the idea that the self may be a kind of story that's told by a modular system that's helping us in some way navigate the world. Okay, so those are our topics. I'm going to talk about these in turn. So first we will talk about question one, how do we know about our own mental states? And I do want to discuss this, but I think the way into this discussion that I think is best is to think about a slightly different question to begin with. So to begin with, I don't want us to think about how we know our own mental states, but rather let's just think about how we know the mental states of others. And to kick off this kind of reasoning, I took a little bit of this book, the book My Struggle, which is a first-person biographical essay by the Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard. So that's this guy. And so Knausgaard's book, My Struggle, it is actually a very lengthy biography. So it's published in 6 volumes, and here's a picture of those books. So this whole thing is around 3,500 pages in length. And the part we're reading, or the part that you read today, comes from the beginning of the 3rd of these books, which discusses Knausgaard's childhood as a young boy. So the reading I want to start with, or this reading, is from Knausgaard. And here we're thinking about, how do we know about other people? How do we know about the internal lives of other people? And I just think this is a beautiful piece of writing that Knausgaard has here. So how do we know about the mental states of others? Well, what he says here is, I draw on everything I remember from the first 6 years of my life and all that exists in terms of photos and objects from that period. They constitute an important part of my identity, filling the otherwise empty and memoryless periphery of this me with meaning and continuity. From all these bits and pieces, I have built myself a Karl Ove, an Yngve, a mom and dad, a house in Hove, and a house in Tybacken, a grandmother and grandfather on my father's side, and a grandmother and grandfather on my mom's side, a neighborhood, and a multitude of kids. This ghetto-like state of incompleteness is what I call my childhood. Okay, so here Knausgaard is talking about coming to know about, or to construct a story about, the people and things around him, right? And it's clear that this story has to be a kind of construction. What's being done here is not kind of direct access to these people. He doesn't know his brother Yngve, he doesn't know Yngve's mind by simply reaching out and touching it in some way. In some way, he's constructing this idea of these other people, of his brother Yngve, of his mom and his dad, even of himself back at this time. In some way, we can construct an idea of who people are, people different from ourselves or people remote from us in the past. But how do we do this? Well, it seems like we do this by inferring what their internal states are from what we have observed and from the incomplete memories that we have of them. So I think Knausgaard here is really striking a chord with Ryle. And so I think I see sort of the same idea in the reading you looked at from Gilbert Ryle when he writes as follows. One limitation has always been conceded to the mind's power of finding mental states and operations, namely that while I can have direct knowledge of my own states and operations, I cannot have it of yours. I am conscious of all my own feelings, volitions, emotions, and thinkings, and I introspectively scrutinize some of them. But I cannot introspectively observe or be conscious of the workings of your mind. I can satisfy myself that you have a mind at all only by complex and frail inferences from what your body does. Okay, so here Ryle is discussing a view which is not his own, so he's arguing against this view, but he's saying according to a kind of a classical view of self-knowledge, we have a special kind of access to ourselves, but our knowledge of others is going to be inferential. And I really want to emphasize this word, inferences, right? So it's always going to be, I'm always going to come to know about your mind, according to this classical view, by inferences from what your body does, right? So I see you walking across the cafe towards the pizza area, or across the commons towards where the pizza is delivered. I don't know what's it called, like Eat at Ed's. No, that's a different place. It's the pizza place. You're walking over there. I see you walking there. And I think to myself, well, from what your body is doing, I believe that you have a desire to have some pizza with your lunch, right? So that's a kind of inference I'm making based upon your bodily behaviors, right? So this classical view says, well, that's how we know about other people's minds. And indeed, that seems to be the only possible way I could know about your mind, is inferring it from your behavior. But how do we know about our own mind? Well, according to the classical view of self-knowledge, our self-knowledge is privileged. Okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean to say that our self-knowledge is privileged? Well, for one thing, it means it's attained in quite a different way than we attain knowledge of others. I don't merely infer my own mental states. Instead, it's been thought necessary, as Ryle says, according to these people that he's opposed to, these classical theorists who propose a kind of privileged self-knowledge. They have thought that minds possess powers of apprehending their own states and operations superior to those they possess of apprehending facts of the external world, right? So traditionally, we have thought that our knowledge of our own mental states is superior to our knowledge of either the external world or of other people's minds. Our knowledge of our own minds is in some way more direct and more trustworthy. In particular, theorists who have suggested a kind of privileged account of self-knowledge have argued that we are conscious, and what they mean by this is that we cannot help being aware of what's going on in our minds. So people who've promoted this kind of classical privileged account of self-knowledge have suggested that we are conscious. We can't help being aware of what's going on in our minds, right? If you are sad, you know you are sad. If you are angry, you know you are angry, and so on. And they have also maintained that we can introspect, or we have introspection. And so what that means is that we can scrutinize our own mental states and operations, okay? So these are two specific ideas that are behind this idea of privileged self-knowledge. Now, Ryle wants to object to this classical privileged account of self-knowledge. Indeed, he thinks that we know about our own mental states in the same way that we know about the mental states of others, from inferring them from our behavior. So he's offering a kind of inferential account of self-knowledge, right? He rejects consciousness in the sense described and introspection. Now, he does think we can be aware, or he thinks we can be unaware of our person level or system 2 mental states, that is. So I may be experiencing a mental state that I'm unaware of. I may be thinking that something is the case. I may be sad and not notice it. This follows from his rejection of consciousness. There are mental states that I can have in my mind that I'm unaware of, even in my person level or system 2 mind. And Ryle also denies that we can inspect our mental states in a special way that we can't apply to the mental states of others. Instead, he thinks that we know our own mental states in just the same way in which we know the mental states of others, and that is inferentially from behaviors and other observable data, right? So how do I know that I'm in a particular state? Well, in the same way that I know you're in a particular state, by seeing the ways that I'm inclined to behave, by seeing the ways, by hearing the things that I say. Those are all evidence as to my beliefs, just as they're evidence for me of your beliefs. So Ryle rejects consciousness. Oops, sorry, that's already been written there. Here's the other part. Sorry, there's a little bit of a mistake at this point. Let's see. Here's the next part. Okay, so back to the main story here. So Ryle contends that we know our own mental states in the same way in which we know the mental states of others, and that is inferentially from behaviors and other observable data. So as Ryle writes, the sort of things that I can find out about myself are the same as the sorts of things that I can find out about other people. And the methods of finding them out are much the same. John Doe's ways of finding out about John Doe, that is himself, are the same as John Doe's ways of finding out about Richard Roe. So as you read this article, you'll see some of the details of this account from Ryle. I think it's a very interesting account of how we acquire our own self-knowledge. It's really developed in some ways by another reading you're looking at by Peter Carruthers. But I'm just going to fill you in on a couple finer details of Ryle's account. So these are some details of Ryle's inferential self-knowledge account. First, note that Ryle's position applies to knowledge of both dispositional states and occurrent states. And so what is this distinction? Well, a dispositional state is a state that we may be said to have over time, or that might be a relatively permanent mental state of ours. So for example, I can come to know, according to Ryle, that I am sarcastic, that is disposed to sarcasm, again, it's a dispositional state, by noticing the sorts of jokes I laugh at and the kinds of comments I make, right? Those are all evidence to this dispositional state that I am sarcastic. Additionally, I can come to know that I understand an argument, another dispositional state, by paraphrasing it in my own words, or responding to it cogently, or a variety of other activities. And Ryle discusses these on page 151 to 152 of your reading. So Ryle thinks we come to know about our dispositional states, these kind of permanent states, through inference from our behaviors. And he also thinks that we can come to know of our occurrent states, that is, states that are taking place right at this minute. We can know about these through our behavior as well. So for example, I can know that I was thinking of the solution to a crossword in the same way I might know that you were, because I was working the crossword, paused for a moment, looked into the sky, and then wrote down the answer. Or I can know I was expecting rain because I put the cushions away on my patio furniture, right? So this is how we can infer what our occurrent states are from our behavior. So that's one detail of Ryle's account. Other details. So Ryle holds, and you can look in details to why he thinks this is the case, but he holds that in some ways I'm in a better position than you to judge my mental states and properties, right? Why might he think this is the case? Well, because I spend more time around myself than I spend around anyone else, and I spend more time around myself than you spend around me. So I just have lots more evidence to go on, and that puts me in a better position to infer what my mental states are from my behaviors. But there are also ways in which you're in a better position than me to judge my mental states and properties, right? So imagine if I'm giving you an oral exam about whether you understand some particular concept we've discussed in Introduction to Cognitive Science. Well, I may be in a better position to judge your performance on this than you are, because you're in the process of generating the performance, right? And so that's going to distract you away from trying to make an assessment of how good the performance is. So I may be a better judge of whether or not you actually understand a concept than you are, simply because I'm not in the first person position. So in this way, Ryle thinks, well, in some cases I am in a better position to judge my mental states than you are, but in some other ways, you're in a better position to judge my mental states than I am. Additionally, and this is an important point for some of our discussions last week, I talk with you each in these kind of divided up ways, so it's tough to know. I mean, it was brought up in at least one group. According to this view, there is no danger of solipsism, right? Solipsism is the view that there is no mind other than my own mind. And we might think that we are embedded in a kind of skepticism about other minds that we can't escape from if we think that we have a special kind of access to our own mind. Because if I have this special kind of access to my own mind, then my knowledge of your mind can only ever be a poorer reflection of this pure thing I have about my own mind, right? And indeed, the problem of other minds has been a kind of classic problem in philosophy, during which, philosophers have assumed quite generally a kind of privileged access view of my own mental states. So it's been a real problem if we adopt this kind of firsthand privileged access view of our other mental states to explain how we have similar knowledge of others' mental states. But the inferential self-knowledge account that Ryle and Carruthers promotes has no danger of slipping into solipsism, because according to this view, I know that I have mental states in the same way that I know that you have mental states, because I infer that your intelligence from your behavior, right? Just as assured I am of knowing that I have a mind, I'm equally assured of knowing that you have a mind. Okay, I want to just end the discussion of self-knowledge by looking at a kind of recent update to Ryle's theory. So again, Ryle is offering this kind of inferential account of self-knowledge. He's suggesting that we know our own mental states based upon inference from our behaviors. A similar recent view has been put forward by this guy, Peter Carruthers, in a book called The Opacity of Mind, published in 2011. Carruthers suggests what he calls an interpretive sensory access theory. He also calls this the ISA theory. And so what are the main components of this theory? Well, according to Carruthers, there is a single mental system underlying our attributions of propositional attitudes, whether to ourselves or others. So notice here that the topic of Carruthers' aim is more restricted than Ryle. So Carruthers is saying it's our propositional attitudes in particular, our beliefs, our desires, our wishes, our considerations, our entertainings, all of these kinds of propositional attitudes are what is the target of his account. And he's saying, well, how do I know that I believe a certain thing? How do I know that I want a certain thing to happen? And his answer to that is, well, there's a single mental system that underlies our attributions of desires and beliefs and all these other propositional attitudes to other people. And that same system turned upon ourselves is what allows us to know about our own propositional attitudes. So he's suggesting, in a sense, that there is this kind of system, and I think he's understands system here in a kind of hierarchically arranged modular way, a kind of automatic evolved mechanism for understanding the mental states of others, and that system can be turned on ourselves. Indeed, Carruthers thinks that this mental faculty evolved to sustain and facilitate outward-looking or other directed forms of social cognition. So this mental faculty, the mental state attribution system, it evolved so that we could attribute or figure out what the mental states of those around us were. And Carruthers thinks there's a very good reason for why it would have evolved under that condition. It's important for me to know what you're thinking or feeling in order that I can work with you or overcome you if we're enemies. And so there's a good explanation of why we would have evolved a system for understanding the mental states of others. And then Carruthers thinks that this system essentially is just going to end up being turned on ourselves. So once we evolve the system to think about others, we're also able to apply it to ourselves. But how do we apply it to ourselves? So if this is a modular system, what is the domain of inputs that it pays attention to? Carruthers thinks that the system has only sensory access to its domain. So whatever leads it to figure out that someone, either you or me, is in a particular mental state is sensory information. So for you, I hear the words you say, I see you walking in a certain direction, right? All of that kind of sensory information is what turns this module on, what leads me to attribute mental states to you, right? And it's only sensory information that does that. That makes perfect sense when we think about other people, but also Carruthers thinks this is true of us as well. So it is my sensory experience of my own behaviors, but also we have some, on Carruthers' view, some kinds of internal mental states that are felt and felt only by us, things like pain. And those are available too. That's part of the domain that this system uses to figure out what my mental states are. But in any case, whatever information turns on the system, whatever its input domain, it's part of sensory experience, okay? And then the last part of Carruthers' thesis is that the access that this system has to our attitudes, or indeed to the attitudes of others, is interpretive. And I think here he just means something very similar to inferential. We're not gonna get too hung up on that. But this access to our attitudes, our propositional attitudes, is interpretive. It's kind of inference from the evidence that we have, and it's not transparent. So we don't have any transparent access to our own mental states. So again, single mental system that underlies our attributions of propositional attitudes to others. That system can be that system evolved to look at others, but can be turned on itself, turned on ourselves to think about our own mental states. The kind of input domain that this system pays attention to is sensory information, and it allows us to interpret what our mental states are or what the mental states of others are, but in no case is this transparent. In no case is there kind of a inward looking towards our propositional attitudes to figure out what we actually believe or what we actually want. Okay, we can talk more about these views later in the week. I want to turn now to the other question I wanted to talk about, which is, what is a self? Okay. Now, the podcast that you listen to lays out a lot of information about what a self is. So it lays out a particular kind of view of what a self is. And Invisibilia, the podcast you listen to, is going to eventually call into doubt this idea of the self. But let's just think initially about what are the things that they say people attribute to a self. And this is the discussion that begins on the church steps or the courthouse steps relative to people getting married. So what is a self? Well, some things that we might say is a self is kind of the fundamental aspect of a person. So this is what some people say in that podcast, that it's a unified in experience and outlook, right? That it is self-aware, that it's reflectively conscious, that it can know what's going on within it. And we've just talked a little bit about that, of course. That it's consistent throughout the life of the individual, that even though your opinions about things or your beliefs may change, who you are stays the same. Again, another important theme that people pointed out in some of our discussions last week. And that it contains a personality. So what is a personality? Well, it's a set of internal consistent characteristics, supposedly, that explain and predict the individual's behavior, and the personality is primarily responsible for whatever happens to a person. Okay, so this is the idea of a self that that is intuitive to us. Maybe it's kind of a classical conception of what selfhood is. But what the Invisibilia podcast and the Dennett article want to argue are the following. Well, the Invisibilia podcast wants to say there is no consistent personality. There is no thing that is fundamentally the same across all instances, right? And additionally, Dennett says that the self is nothing more than a useful fiction. So let's talk about these two kinds of components to finish out the presentation for this week. So I think, one telling story in the podcast is the story of Dan, the prisoner who a character in this podcast works with on some TEDx talks, right? So Dan is a violent criminal, right? Dan has committed a violent rape in his past, right? He has marks of his violent criminal past on his body. But he seems totally changed in prison. He seems enlivened by the TEDx event. He writes poetry, right? He's really self-reflective, really intelligent, right? He doesn't seem like he is someone that could hurt anyone. Now, here's the question that the podcast begins with. Has Dan really changed, or is Dan still the same person that he was when he committed the crime that got him locked up? And so I think that's a question that you might consider here. The podcast doesn't really give us an answer to that, but it takes some different positions on what might be going on. It notes, for example, that Dan himself thinks that he has changed. He thinks the other guy, the guy who committed those crimes, is dead, and that in a sense he's serving out another person's sentence. The other guy, on his conception, was that other personality, but he doesn't think of personality as being permanent and existing throughout a lifetime. But if the podcast and Walter Mischel, the psychologist who's discussed in the podcast, are right, then Dan hasn't really changed, right? He hasn't changed, but it's also true that he's not really the same person. And the reason that this view ends up getting suggested in the podcast is the basic idea that there is no personality in any robust sense, right? Instead, It's just Dan's situation that has changed. He's no longer in that violent atmosphere that disposed him to act in a certain way. Instead, he's built this calm atmosphere, this atmosphere of learning around himself in prison. And that's what the atmosphere that he's created or that he's become a part of explains why he behaves or seems so radically different in this case. This is the basic idea that's put forward in the podcast, the idea that personality is not consistent. And there are a variety of different studies that suggest this conclusion. So some of these, or one of these that's discussed, is very early studies by Hartshorne and May in the 1930s. So they did a variety of studies in which they put children in situations where there was a temptation to cheat. These were different kinds of situations, right? So for example, in one test, children were given a paper and pencil test. The completed papers were collected and then duplicated, copied. And then the papers were returned to the children, the ones they had written, with a key for self-marking. So here, children had the opportunity to inflate their scores, but the experimenters could check on this by looking at the duplicates, like duplicated it first. So they would check and see with the key if the child changed some of their answers to make their score better. This is just one of a variety of tests that they would give, though. They give children opportunities to steal things. They would give children opportunities to lie in other ways. And they found that in these variety of situations, that children displayed little consistency across the situations, little consistency to cheat across different situations, right? So a child who cheated in marking his or her score on the paper and pencil test might or might not be honest or altruistic in one of the other moral dilemmas, right? So through these moral dilemmas, they could see that there was little continuity between whether a child evidenced a moral response or an immoral response across different situations. What is the upshot of this? Well, the upshot is an idea that we're going to come back to again, which is essentially situationalism. So the idea is this, that it is the situation that makes the difference and not some internal characteristic, okay? This is a kind of other competing view within cognitive science. So there are some people who emphasize individualism or internal characteristics as being important, and there are others who emphasize situations as being important. So in the Hartshorne and May study, situational pressures might lead many or even most people to cheat, or to be honest, depending upon the exact nature of the situation. So that's the basic idea behind situationalism. Situations explain what character, the previously existing notion of character, is unable to explain. Another important demonstration of this idea of situationalism is provided by the Milgram experiment, or the Milgram experiments, published in 1965. So, right, in the Milgram experiment, you all heard about this in the podcast, and you're probably familiar with it already anyway, many of you. So the Milgram experiment, right, there is a student, someone playing a student role. This is actually a Confederate, someone working with the experimenter. The Confederate, right? So they would have these two people show up at the lab. One of them would be working with the experimenter. One would be the true test subject. And so the person who's working with the experimenter, the Confederate of the experimenter, is always given the role of teacher or student in this study. And the person who's really being the experimental subject is given the role of teacher, okay? The study is presented as involving memorization of a list of words, okay? Pretty long list of words. And the study is said to be a study of the degree to which punitive force can actually lead someone to learn, to remember better, okay? So the Confederate of the experimenter is chosen as the student. They're taken into another room. They're hooked up to this series of electrodes. And the other person is given the role of teacher, okay? And so the teacher has to go over this list of words. The student has to memorize them, but the student is also hooked up to these electrodes. The experimenter is told that anytime the teacher is told that anytime the student messes up, forgets a word, a shock should be given. And these shocks will steadily increase as they go up. Okay, these shocks will steadily increase as the student makes more mistakes. Okay, so we might ask ourselves, well, what are the results of this study? Do people typically deliver a high level of shocks? We might think, well, the maximum level of shock. How many people typically go all the way to the maximum level of shock? Indeed, this question was given to 14 Yale students, 14 Yale University senior year psychology majors, who were asked to predict the behavior of 100 hypothetical teachers. So they were told, okay, imagine 100 people who are put in the role of experimental test subject here. So they're given the role of a teacher, and they're told to shock the student whenever they miss a question. So they asked, how many do you think will go all the way to the maximum 450 volt shock? These 14 Yale students were asked this of 100 hypothetical teachers. How many do you think would go all the way to the 450 volt shock? And here's what they said. These 14 Yale University students all believe that only a very small fraction of teachers would inflict the maximum voltage. So the average prediction was that about 1% of test subjects in the teacher role would go all the way to the maximum 450 volt shock. However, in Milgram's first set of experiments, he found that 65%, that's 26 out of 40 participants, administered the experiment's final massive 450 volt shock, though many were very uncomfortable doing so. Indeed, they were made to be more uncomfortable by the fact that the confederate of the experimenter, the person in the student role behind the blockade where they couldn't see them, screamed loudly as they were approaching the final 450 volt shock. But even though they were deterred by those screams, 65% of participants made it there. So we tend to think that people are good, but if we put them in the right situation, they will behave badly, behave in immoral ways. Some more results from this study. Adults were likely to disobey, 90% of them, if they had seen two other people do so. So if we're put in a situation where we see other people disobeying an instructor, or disobeying the experimenter. So in this study, there was a lab person who kept telling them, you need to increase the shock. You need to give the shock for the good of science, right? If it's just the person by themselves, 65% of them go all the way to the maximum shock. But if they're in a room where they see two other people disobey the scientist, then 90% of those individuals who have seen two other people disobey will disobey. They'll leave the study. They'll say, I'm not going any further with this, right? So if we're in a situation where we see other people acting on the basis of morality against authority, we'll be more likely to do so ourselves. People are also more likely to disobey if the experimenter issued orders by phone rather than being present, right? So if the experimenter, the guy in the lab coat, isn't in the lab, but is just talking to them by phone and saying, oh, you need to turn it up, you need to deliver more of a shock, that situation is not one that's as likely to elicit the behavior of shocking the person at the maximum level. People were more likely to disobey the experimenter if the authority figure was in a military uniform rather than a lab smock. And I ask you to think about why this might be the case. Some students have come up with some interesting theories about this in the past, but I think it's an interesting one to consider. And then finally, participants were more likely to disobey. 70% of them disobeyed if they had to press the victim's hand on a shock plate rather than simply administer the shock with the victim seated in another room. So if I'm pressing your hand, if I have to press your hand on the shock plate after you get the wrong answer, I'll be more likely to opt out of the experiment and stop shocking you. If I'm sitting in the other room, most of the time people will go on all the way. So what do these studies show? Or what does this study show? In effect, it shows that depending on how you set up the situations, you can elicit totally different behaviors from people. And that they don't seem to be guided by this kind of constant moral compass, this constant personality that makes them who they are. It instead seems to be situational in some deep way. So as the podcast mentioned, the Milgram experiment is just one of a number of experiments from social psychology in this period that reiterated this kind of situational perspective on individuals. Another is the Stanford prison experiments. You may have heard of this experiment done by this guy, Philip Zimbardo. We're going to read a paper by him later in the term. But Zimbardo essentially took a basement in a Stanford psych lab, and he recruited participants from the student body. He split these participants into two groups, so the cops and the prisoners. And then, these were just average Stanford students. I think they were all male students. And what he found was that the people who were given the role of police, who were given the accoutrements of policemen, began to behave in very sadistic ways towards the people that were presented as prisoners. I should say prison guard and prisoner. And the prisoners indeed adopted a subservient behavior, the subservient behavior of prisoners. And this happened after only a few hours, not even a few days. So when you put these ordinary people into these particular situations, what we find is that their behavior comes to match the situation. There's not some kind of core behavioral or core characteristic to them that shines through in these situations, or at least this would be what Zimbardo or some of the more striking people who want to put forward this view might say. And I ask you to question whether you think this is true or not, or whether you think there is some preserving or enduring characteristic of personality or of the self that we can pick out in these experiments. So indeed, all of this suggests that what we think of as our core personality, the fact that we are kind or generous, that we don't harm others, that we love our parents, is perhaps impermanent. Put in the right situation, any of these traits might disappear. And so the question that we're going to be thinking about this week is whether personality is really this fleeting, or if we've missed something about it. Okay, I want to conclude by thinking about the article from Dan Dennett. So Dan Dennett is considering a variety of cases related to split brain patients. So his article importantly considers these kind of split brain patients. So these are patients who are suffering from grand mal seizures, which essentially means big, bad seizures. These are really life-threatening seizures that people could sometimes have. It's known that a seizure disorder is caused because of a kind of signaling problem between the two hemispheres of the brain. So one strategy for dealing with these grand mal seizures, in the worst cases, is to perform what's called a corpus callosomy, which is essentially a callosotomy, I think. A corpus callosotomy, which is essentially a severing of this giant nerve that connects this nerve fiber or nerve channel that connects the two hemispheres of your brain, the corpus callosum. If we split the corpus callosum, we can stop that signal from reverberating across the two hemispheres of the brain and give people some relief from these life-threatening grand mal seizures. But this also comes with costs, Because once we do this, then the two hemispheres of the brain cannot communicate with one another. So typically there are messages sent across the corpus callosum, this bundle of nerves. When we sever that, the two hemispheres can't talk to one another as efficiently. So what is the outcome of that? Well, these patients have been studied many times. There have been a number of studies done on these patients. So in one study, for example, someone may be shown an image to, they may be shown an image with to one eye, right? Our optic nerves flip. So if you're shown an image to your left eye, that travels to the right side of your brain. And it may influence your behavior from the right side of the brain, but language using capacities are all localized in the left hemisphere of the brain. And so if the right side of the brain can't communicate to the left side, then I can't articulate why I behaved in the way that I did if it's on the basis of something that only the right side of my brain knows, okay? So in one set of studies, someone will be told in some way to go get something out of the house, right? This is a person who has this corpus callostomy procedure. They're sitting in a test trailer outside of their house. Maybe they're, taught to, they're shown a picture of themselves going inside to get their coat. Okay, so that's shown to the right hemisphere. The patient, it's not shown to the right eye, so the left hemisphere doesn't know what's going on. The patient in these kinds of studies will sometimes get up and start walking out of the trailer towards the house. They will then be asked, where are you going, right? Now the left side of the brain has to respond because it's the language using side of the brain. So what does it say? Well, it doesn't have the information about why it's going inside. That was only given to the right side of the brain. So what it does is it confabulates. It tells a kind of story about why it was going inside. In some of these cases, or in one of these cases, for example, the patient says, I'm going to get a Diet Coke. I have a bunch in the fridge, right? But we know that's not the reason they got up. It was because of whatever was presented to the right hemisphere, which was a completely different thing. Another example, discussed in the article. So someone reaches into a bag and feels around and feels something. They're asked, what's in the bag, right? This side, they would be using their left hand, right? So all the information, again, the brain receives information from the opposite side of the body. So the nerves on the left side of the body connect to the right brain. So they reach in with their left hand, they feel this thing, they're asked what's in the bag. They draw a picture of it, like suppose it's a spoon. So they draw a picture of a spoon. And now they're asked, why did you draw that? Now, the right side of the brain was in charge of producing that drawing. And again, it can't communicate to the left side of the brain, who now has to answer the question. So what does the left side of the brain say? Well, again, it confabulates, it makes up a story. So asked, why did you draw that? Patients might say something like, well, I was just thinking of when I was a kid and I had to shovel out the chicken coop. So I drew that shovel there, right? Not understanding that this was a spoon that was drawn, right? And just confabulating a story of why that happened. So what does Dennett think that these examples show? Well, in effect, what Dennett thinks of this shows is that we're a bundle of processes, right? Right. And indeed, Dennett thinks that what's true of these corpus callostomy patients is true of the rest of us too, right? We often confabulate what our behavior is, or we often confabulate what our beliefs and desires are, or we often confabulate the mental explanations for our action, right? And this, of course, just lines up perfectly with the ISA theory, right? If what's going on is we're predicting our behavior based upon we're predicting our mental states or inferring our mental states based upon what we observe from our behaviors, well, we would expect to see exactly what is going on with the corpus callostomy patient. So notice The difference in these patients is revealed only through clever methods in the laboratory, right? Corpus callosum patients are virtually indistinguishable from anyone else in their day-to-day life, right? So the basic idea that Dennett has is that we are kind of a bundle of processes, right? It's just that our processes sometimes have better ways to communicate with one another so they can get some information across. But in fact, our knowledge of our own mental states is not as assured as we might hope, and the self, each of our selves, are not as unified as we might have hoped. Instead, what these studies seem to show is that we are, in fact, a variety of processes that are going on with a story spinning mechanism built in that tells a story about our own mental lives. Or at least, that's the most extreme version of this view. So I want to end with some of the theoretical implications of Dennett's view. So Dennett suggests that the self is a kind of center of narrative gravity. And what does he mean by this? Well, essentially what Dennett wants to suggest is that selves are in the class of predictably useful things that are unreal, okay? So Dennett's article suggests that selves are in the class of predictably useful but unreal things. And he thinks this is a class that contains lots of members. I'm going to call it predictably useful but unreal thing, PUBUTs. Okay, so what are some other PUBUTs? Well, one that Dennett discusses is the center of gravity. So think about a center of gravity, right? I might think that a chair has a certain center of gravity, or that I have a certain center of gravity. This idea of where the center of gravity in the chair is may help me behave in certain ways, right? Like I may know I can tilt the chair this far without it falling over because of where its center of gravity is. Additionally, maybe I practice judo, and knowing where my center of gravity is allows me to better perform judo. But a center of gravity isn't really a real thing that's to be found somewhere in the body or something like that. It's a kind of abstraction away from the gravitational pull of all the different parts of my body, right? There isn't really such a thing as a center of gravity, but it's a useful abstraction away from all of these other properties of my body, the gravitational pull of the various parts that allows us to navigate the world better. Another example, the average voter, right? By thinking about the average voter, if I'm a campaign manager or something, I may come up with a strategy for attracting the average voter. But of course, there's no real average voter out there. It's not as though I can go find the average voter living across the street from me or something like that. The average voter is predictably useful, but it's not really a real thing. It's kind of an abstract concept. Similarly, we may talk about a team spirit, and that may be useful to us, but of course, that's not anything real. And then Dennett suggests that the self is in the same category, the category of PUBUTs, that it's a predictably useful, but an ultimately unreal thing. So what is a self? I'm going to skip over that. Well, essentially, what a self is as a kind of is kind of a unifying narrative feature that explains how people behave, right? I can have an idea of yourself, I can have an idea of myself, and in having these ideas, I can make sense of my behavior and predict my behavior. So that's the basic idea, is that this self is a thing that's useful for us in telling a story, right? It's something we infer maybe from our kind of behaviors, the things we say, the things that we do. And it's something that we construct as a kind of narrative of ourselves. But ultimately, this may be a kind of story that we're spinning for ourselves that is the result of some system that we have in our mind for bringing our actions into kind of unified relation to one another. Okay, so that is the basic idea here. And where have we ended up with system 2? Well, it looks like system 2 now that kind of felt person level component, what some of the things we've been reading this week suggest is that that's a kind of fiction that we're presenting to ourselves because it's useful to us, not because it's real in some way. Indeed, maybe the mind is massively modular, as some have suggested, and just one of those modules is a storytelling module that tells a story about what our life is. But it's just a kind of sub-process that's built into us to help unify this kind of bag of processes that is really what we are. Okay, so if cells and personalities are ultimately unreal, why do we believe in them so robustly? Well, I just want to end by pointing to two reasons that are discussed in the podcast, the Invisibilia podcast. And these are reasons from Walter Mischel. He emphasizes the first one of these. So again, situationalism. Well, we are, as a matter of fact, typically constrained by our situations, even if we don't have any rich personality or any rich selfhood. So that is what actually explains why people are consistent over time. And that is why we might think that they have a stable personality. And another possibility is that there's also a role for confirmation bias in here. So if I'm kind of telling the story about who you are, or the story about who I am, then what does that process look like? It's always a process of taking some set of information and causing it to cohere with this larger story that's being told. It may be that it's impossible to bring all of our different actions, all the things we do in line with that kind of conception. So what we may do, we know that confirmation bias is well confirmed in the human mind. So we may pay attention to certain aspects, certain evidence, and bring that more into focus when we're thinking about who we actually are. We may attend to the information that confirms with the story that we're already telling, right, about ourselves or about you, and disregard the rest. So that might be another reason for why we believe we have a constant self. Okay, I hope this has been a good introduction to the readings for this week. That is going to be it, and I will see you in the next day or two. Goodbye.